And there we go. So, good evening, and thank you for joining me. My name is Tad. We are going to be doing what? Saying farewell to February for one very important thing. Not that February has been a bad month, not at all. February is generally a very good month. And certainly in terms of good news on the COVID front and other things like that, it's been a very good February so far. I don't know if you can hear the noise in the background. That's one of the Chihuahuas that barking in very sharply, which means that he's getting fed or about to get fed. Anyway, so good evening. It is 7:01. I'm going to do a little bit of reading this evening. It is that 7:01, of course, is California time. Not everybody's on the same time, although we're mostly all in the same universe. There are points at which one has to wonder, but yes, we are more or less all in the same universe, just in different time zones. And mine is the Pacific Standard Time Zone, because we're right sitting here on the edge of the western shelf of the North American continent. And I'm going to be reading some more of War of the Flowers. We're getting near the end of the story. We're not going to finish tonight, though. But we are getting near the end of the story, so things are happening left, right, and center very rapidly. I didn't have a lot to update people on last night when I did the earlier part of this 2 on Sunday broadcast schedule. And that is largely because things are not changing dramatically, although we're hoping sometime in the middle of this next month we can get our daughter in to get shot. Get a vaccination, and that will move everything forward a bit for us. In the meantime, I actually left the house today. That was very exciting. I haven't done that in at least a week, and went out and did a little bit of birthday shopping and picked up some necessities for the household and stuff like that there. So that was my thrill for the day. I was driving around on a beautiful 65-degree end of February day, listening to Michael Kiwanuka, who is a brilliant musician. If you don't know his work, I strongly recommend it. His third album, which is just called Kiwanuka, Kiwanuka, if I remember correctly, won the Mercury Prize in Britain. Just really fascinating, wonderful record. It's not easily describable. It's not rock and roll. It's not soul. It's not, I don't know what you call it. It's all kinds of things, and it's full of wonderful ideas and just excellent music. So anyway, that's a suggestion. If you're looking for something new to listen to and you don't know Michael Kiwanuka, that would be a good thing to start with for just about anybody who likes music, I think. Anyway, so let's see who's here and say hello to folks who have come in and registered at the front desk of the Hotel Tadfornia. And Kelly. Hi, Kelly. Good evening. Jared. Good to see you too. And Carl. Hello. Becca. Good evening. Claudia checking in from Virginia. Hello. Good to see you, Claudia. Timothy. Lovely, Timothy. Timothy says, one of my heroes. I'm not sure who Timothy's referring to. Maybe Michael Kiwanuka. I have no idea because I can't tell when these were posted. But Jeremy, hello, namaste to you too. Barban, hello, Barban, good to see you. Greg, hello, good evening. Emily, you watched the 5 a.m. readings. My God, that is really early for you. Okay, it's even earlier for me, of course, but that's okay because I haven't gone to bed yet. Hello to Tad Time friends. Oh my God, is that what we're going to call this now? Felina, hello, good to see you. Drop me in. I haven't checked my messages in the last couple of days. Felina, I sent you something in the mail. Let me know if you didn't get that or if you did get that at some point. It's your leisure. Kenneth, hello, Kenneth. Medardo. All right, good to see you, Medardo. And always a pleasure to have you join us. Nancy, hi, Nancy. How are you? Becca, yes, cute doggos. Well, the Walter, the one you heard upstairs, he's extremely cute. He's actually a really pretty little dog. He's tiny. I mean, he only weighs like 4 pounds. I think he barely weighed 2 when we got him because he'd been living on the street for about a year, and he was criminally undernourished, among other things. And he's now beautiful and sylph-like, but still very, very slender. He looks like he's a very long-legged Chihuahua. He looks a bit like a mini pin, if you've ever seen those. And he's a very fine dog, except that when he gets excited, he has, not unlike Piglet in the Winnie the Pooh books, he has a tendency to make shrill noises. But other than that, he is just a very fine little dog. And just as long as you don't have to hear him going when he's upset about something or excited. Kelly says, I am sticking. I don't know what sticking means. I hope it's not anything about the quality of the broadcast. And Medardo, I already said hello to and thank you. This isn't necessarily me about to get vaccinated. This is our daughter who has pulmonary issues, and who we need, because the rest of us, of course, are all kind of have adjusted our lifestyle to keep her as safe as possible. J.L. Graves, hello. Lovely to see you too. Brenna, a pleasure, from Calgary. I remember Calgary well. Haven't been there for quite a few years now. I can't remember when we were up there for World Fantasy, but we had a very nice time and just met a ton of really nice people. Regina, I think we decide, from North Carolina. Lovely to see you. Timothy, you meant me, Mr. Williams. I'm sticking. Was that you who said I was sticking? No, somebody said I was sticking. Oh, you meant me who is the hero. Oh my God, you got to get out of the house, Timothy. Emily. Oh, but later after you were saying, okay, Emily qualifies. That's more sensible. I don't think anybody should have to listen to me at 5 o'clock in the morning, not even me. Thank God I'm usually asleep. Jeremy says he thinks Walter stole his bread once. Yes, I would not put it past him. As we said, we got him when he was tiny and malnourished, and he is always looking out for the main chance. He's really kind of he's a little street kid at heart, and not entirely ever trusting. And even when he gets up on your lap and solicits getting his stomach scratched or whatever, there's always, like, he's always poised. Both of our rescue dogs had kind of either had traumatizing early experiences or just are nervous by nature. So that's probably was Walter. Yes, Walter is definitely would take your bread right out of your hand. Kelly, switch devices. Oh, that was the sticking. Okay, good. And yes, it is definitely time to come back. Brenna, no question about it. And Glamorgan, okay. And Regina says a little freeze framing going on. Okay, I don't know of any reason on my end. It all looks perfectly normal. So if something else continues to be a problem for several of you, let me know. We could always start over again, although then I have to set out new URLs on the other social media spots and stuff. So I'd prefer not to, because it gets confusing for people who don't know what's going on, and suddenly the whole feed disappears, and then they have to go find it again, or find out where it is again, or where the new one is. Anyway, a lot of babbling, but that's the basic point. So let me know if it gets too bad. Oh, one of my kids must be gaming and hogging the bandwidth. Oh my God, I'm sure that's it. Yeah, that's a constant problem around here, because we got so many people crammed onto a not super efficient Wi-Fi, setup. I don't know what I can do about that. By the time I go and track them all down and force them to stop, we will have wasted many minutes. So I hope the voice at least will come through all right, because let's face it, a pun. The other part isn't so very meaningful, having to watch me. At least it would upset me. Anyway, I'm also, you may notice I'm wearing a jacket because it's cold down here in the office tonight. I don't know why, because it was perfectly warm outside, but who knows? That's just the way things are sometimes in an older house. And our house, what is not old, certainly not by any standards outside of California, but it was built in the 70s. And I think the people who put it together were kind of like 70s, hey, let's build a house kind of people, because you always find these weird little things that are like, yeah, I don't think a professional carpenter would have done that. It's an odd looking house, which is one of the things we loved about it. But I won't go into too many details because then the government might find me. Um, yeah, like the government cares. Like anybody with any sense cares what we're doing here. Okay, so I'm just trying to find the section where we were reading. And okay, so what's happened is Theo has finally met face to face with the terrible child. And it has been revealed that the terrible child's real birth name was Theo Vilmos, because, of course, the terrible child was the other half of the changeling child swap. Theo was taken to the mortal world as a little baby, the last scion of the Violet family, and left with what he thought were his real parents. The changeling child was brought back, given to the remover of inconvenient obstacles, and has been raised by the Hellebore clan for some plan we don't exactly know yet. But that's what's going on. Meanwhile, the Theo and Cumber and Applecore, whom they have now recovered, are in a huge battle coach with Hellebore and others, and they're being taken across town to some unknown purpose, to some unknown location, and that's where we are. So Theo has just called what is the terrible child referred to him as his half brother. Theo has just told his half brother that he is a freak, a messed up, inhuman freak, and that's where we are, and that's where I will continue. The boy nodded, not at all displeased. I am the only one like me. That is true. There are worse things to be, of course. Average, or less than average. A failure, a non-entity. Speaking of which, did you know I was with you in Daffodil House as you stumbled around in the smoke and dust? I was watching it all through your eyes, drinking your thoughts. Oh, the poor little fairy folk. Oh, the destruction. How sad. I drank your fear, too. It was a very pleasant experience, actually. So at least you're good for something. Theo tried to strike at the child, but could not lift his hand more than a few inches off his lap. Struggling hopelessly, he let out a little moan of frustration and despair. The boy smiled. Even now, you are only still alive because of what other people did years ago, not because of anything you've done yourself. He paused for a moment and sniffed. That sprite is still with you, isn't she? Hiding somewhere. I can smell her. He smacked his lips and opened his eyes wide in a grotesque parody of juvenile pleasure. Yum! It's too bad I've already eaten quite a lot for my afternoon meal. She would be very sweet, I think. And crunchy. Disgust overcame Theo's exhaustion and horror, even gave him a little strength. You're proud of not being human, aren't you? You enjoyed it when they killed our child, the baby that Kat was carrying. Eamon Dowd might have been a bastard, might even have helped, but he didn't enjoy it like you did. Yeah, I can feel it. This thought-drinking thing doesn't just go one way. Jesus Christ, and you think being like you is better than being me? Theo took a shuddering breath. It was difficult to speak, but he couldn't just let the thing smirk at him. I am what I am. The smile flashed like cold bone. I have lived 1,000 lives in my short time, seen 1,000,000 indescribable things, while you've trudged through a single meaningless life, and muddled even that. Your pointless span will end today, but mine will go on. I have been in preparation for this since the first hour I was brought into Fairy. One day I will shake the very secrets of the universe down, like fruit from a tree. That it was his parents' faces combined here in this soulless thing, more than it being a younger version of his own face, more than any words it spoke, finally brought tears to Theo's eyes. He had not done any better a job of loving his mother and father than they had him, but there had been some love there, however muted and confused. This abomination made it all a mockery. He summoned up a little more strength. "I'll destroy you." "Don't talk to it, Dio." "Oh, bite it, trees, don't talk to it," Applecore whispered in his ear. "It'll only poison you." He grunted, too tired to talk more in any case. The child laughed and turned back to the window. "Destroy me? I think not." The stream of alien thought pushed its way into Theo's mind, a cold and painful intruder against which he was helpless. "You are not really Septimus Violet, and you are certainly not Theo Vilmos. In fact, you are nothing." They had reached the top of a hill at the edge of the Moonlight District, the street crowds long gone behind them, when Hellebore directed the convoy to stop, and the 3 coaches pulled up onto the grass of a small manicured park. The city lay below them, threads of smoke rising in many places now, especially down by the waterfront where, true to Anton Hellebore's prediction, the remover's warehouse seemed still to be burning like the heart of the sun. Another large blaze raged in the center of town near the ivory spike of Hellebore House. "Why have we stopped, Lord?" asked Tansy. "Are we under attack?" "They are on their way," Hellebore said, although it didn't seem to explain anything. He raised his voice, perhaps talking to the invisible driver of the coach. "Give me my birds. I wish a closer look at Strawflower Square." The 2 ogre guards got out. The massive coach rocked as their weight was removed, and made a quick check around the vicinity. Satisfied that the park did not contain an ambush, they stood in the muted sun, stretching their long, slab-muscled gray arms and whispering quietly to each other. The bubble dome of the coach flickered just as the windows of Hellebore's penthouse office had, and suddenly the natural cityscape was gone across one side, replaced by a bizarre street-level view of the riot zone around the Parliament, as though the coach in which Theo sat had suddenly dived down into the city center like a submarine. "The constables have been reinforced, but I see there is still resistance," said Hellebore. "Too much resistance. I think that when this has ended, Lord Monkshood will no longer hold domain over the constables. This has been a debacle. Well, I will do what his men cannot." Theo was too distracted by what he was seeing in the actual sky above them to pay much attention to the scenes of constables and mounted grims fighting across the rubble of Strawflower Square's fountains and benches and public walkways. Coming down through the clouds like kites on a single string were 3 vast serpentine shapes. It was so much like that awful day in Daffodil House that for a moment Theo found himself plunged into a disassociated near faint, suspended in a loop of unreality where dragons were always coming down the sky toward him like living missiles. The huge beasts dropped so fast that it seemed as though they must crash down on the hillside where Theo's coach stood, must smash and destroy the caravan and everything in it. Hellebore, and Theo, and Applecore, and the monstrous pink-faced child. He found himself half praying for it as the huge dark bodies plummeted toward them. Then, just a few hundred feet overhead, 3 mighty pairs of bat-like wings flared out, and the dragon's descent suddenly flattened. They swooped over the park, only a couple of hundred feet off the ground, with a crack of air that knocked the ogre bodyguards to their knees, ripped branches from the bending trees, and made the coaches rock crazily on their suspensions. Theo could see that the nearest dragon had a rider, a small humanoid shape crouched in a boxy glass case strapped around the massive neck just in front of the wings. The stink of the monsters, sulfur and a rank, sour odor like the alligator pool at the San Francisco Aquarium on a hot day, lingered in Theo's nostrils even after the dragons themselves were only dwindling shapes against the city skyline. As horrible as the creature's passage had been, he still found himself turning with a kind of miserable avidity to the coach window that displayed Strawflower Square, not so much wanting to see what would happen next as unable to avoid looking. There was a feeling of supreme aliveness in witnessing such a horror. He knew that now. It sang in the blood. To watch death, no matter how terrible, was to be alive oneself, at least for a few moments longer. The dragons entered the mirror picture of the square, first as long shadows that whipped across the crowd so quickly that many of the combatants didn't even look up. But terror filled the faces of all who did see them, even the parliamentary constables. Only the Grimms kept their faces set, hard and cold, as if a long-anticipated moment had finally come, although they threw themselves from their unicorns and scrambled for shelter like the rest of the shrieking multitude. The dragons rushed past like stunting jet planes, wrenching tornadoes of dirt and trash up in their wake, even pieces of clothing ripped from rioters' backs. For a suspended moment, all sign of the monsters disappeared from the scene Theo was watching, so that the thousands of people, fleeing randomly in all directions, seemed conceived of a kind of mass psychosis. But then the shadows fell across the square once more, followed immediately by fire. The first great gout swept across the broad steps in front of New Mound House like a broom of orange flame, a broom that did not merely tumble away that which was in front of it, but burned it to black carbon. The flames were so hot that the sudden blooms of ash seemed to hold the shapes of the fleeing victims for an instant before bursting into whirling, sparkling fragments. Applecore was weeping loudly beside Theo's ear, but he had no more tears. He could only watch, limp and numb. The second time he had been forced to witness a horror no one should ever have to see once. The viewpoint of the mirror screen was shifting now, moving rapidly away from the destruction and refocusing elsewhere in the square. Jarred by the unsteady movement, Theo found a moment's refuge in wondering what kind of birds they were. These were magical or mechanical that acted as Hellebor's eyes at the scene. The dragons made another pass, sweeping the square with flame, killing all that could not escape, rioters and riot fighters, civilians and constables. A maddened unicorn ran past the fountain, its mane trailing fire. But Theo saw something else happening too, something so strange that even Hellebore sat up in his leather seat. "Blood and iron," growled the fairy lord. "What are they doing?" The Grimms, alone of all the living things in Strawflower Square, were not running for their lives, or at least they had not run very far. Knots of them had taken up places where they were shielded from the worst of the inferno by buildings or statuary, and now were working with a swift economy of movement, unpacking long poles that had hung beside their saddles, bending these staves and stringing them. "Bows?" Hellebore sounded angry as well as surprised, as though the spectacle were aesthetically displeasing. "They are going to fight dragons with arrows?" As the winged monsters came in on their next pass, several of the Grimms leaped out from behind their makeshift ramparts and raised their bows. A dripping burst of fire caught two of them and turned them into shrieking, jigging torches, but the others loosed their arrows before running for cover again. "Are they mad? These skin-eaters?" Hellebore demanded. "They hunted dragons in the old days, stepfather." The terrible child sounded amused. "They do what they know best. I think it involves some kind of very powerful poison." As the dragons wheeled and their shadows again dropped onto the square, a full dozen more of the Grimms darted from cover and fired their shafts. With their long, almost ape-like arms, the wild goblins were perfectly suited to draw such tall, heavy bows. The dragons spat death and then wheeled away. The Grimms kept loosing arrows until the great winged worms turned and came down again, blazing. Again, And again, the liquid flame splashed across the square, which was now covered with leaping fires even where there seemed nothing that could burn. Again and again, wild goblins were caught and martyred by the spray, but others ran out in the dragon's wake, firing up into the air before the giant creatures could rise out of range. At first it seemed that it was all just some goblin gesture, a bit of primitive bravery in the face of certain death, but finally, on the sixth or seventh pass, all the shadows did not disappear as the dragon swung out of range. One shadow grew in size until darkness covered the entire square. The goblins stared up, shouting to each other and pointing. Let's try that one again. The goblins stared up, shouting to each other and pointing before running for cover as the shadow rapidly began to grow smaller and blacker. The monster was falling. The dragon dropped out of the sky and hit the ground so hard that one of the buildings along the square shuddered and collapsed, adding its own dust to the flume of black blood and gobbets of molten pavement thrown up by the creature's fall. Other facades shook, and the few windows left unbroken now shattered. Then all was silence, the square motionless except for the jittering of flames, the monster lying dead in a crater at the center of a spiderweb of cracked stone, with a thicket of arrows protruding from its great filming eye, and more picketing its long throat. Its tail stretched across the smoldering steps of New Mound House like the snapped cable of a suspension bridge. "It cannot be," said Hellebore. Theo had never imagined he would see the fairy lord so astonished. He almost looked mortal. "It cannot be." "But it is, stepfather," said the child. "Look, and your eyes will tell you the truth. The goblins have killed one of your big lizards. Do you doubt they will manage to kill the rest too? They can afford to sacrifice a few dozen to bring down each one. They will think it a good trade. And can you imagine what will happen to Hellebore House when the mob realizes the high families are actually vulnerable? If you had been paying attention to your private line, you would have just heard the security force calling out to you, telling you that our house is surrounded." The terrible child definitely appeared to be more entertained than upset by what had happened. "And the Grimms have more weapons than simply bows and arrows, the commander says. They are shooting out the windows of our tower with lightning throwers, and many of the guards are dead." "We won't be vulnerable long," said Hellebore. "Into the coach," he shouted at the ogre bodyguards. "Drive, now, straight to the cathedral." The ogres did not even have time to climb all the way into their seats before the armored coach spun around on the park lawn, spitting divots of grass and mud. One of the huge gray creatures almost rolled on Theo, which he couldn't help thinking would be at least a faster way to die than whatever Hellebore had planned for him. "They did it!" Applecore crowed softly by his ear. "Did you see? It was brilliant!" He couldn't help feeling pride. What the goblins had done was more than a heroic gesture. Hellebore was set back, even a little scared, and Theo and Cumber Sedge had helped it happen. "Good old Button," he thought. "That will serve the flower bastards right for underestimating him." Within minutes, they were driving through a sudden mist into a part of the city he had never seen, a district he did not remember even being described in Dowd's journal. The buildings on either side of the increasingly narrow road were odd conglomerations of stone and earth that looked almost like termite mounds or some ancient archaeological site. The dark, foggy streets were empty, and the strange buildings seemed empty too, doors and unglassed windows gaping like the eyes of skulls piled in a catacomb. Even the mist seemed to be growing thicker as the convoy made its way down the sloping streets between the crude, close-leaning buildings. No, Theo realized. It isn't just the mist. The sky itself was growing darker overhead, as though afternoon was ending and evening coming on fast. But evening should still be hours away, he thought. Can you have a power blackout in the sky? Hellebore was snapping orders on his invisible private line. The child was looking calmly out the window, and Tansy seemed lost in some personal realm of pain. But Theo still whispered as he asked Applecore, "Where are we? Why is it getting dark already? Is it the smoke from the fires?" "We're driving into midnight," she said in his ear. Her moment of joy had evaporated, and her voice trembled. "It's not good, Theo. Ever since the king and queen died, nobody comes here except for funerals. It's thick." "What's thick?" "Everything. It just is. Fairy, it gets thick here." The terrible child stirred, took a deep, ecstatic breath. "It is the heart of the realm, home to the first mound where civilization began. But it was alive long before that." He smiled and nodded. "It is where the edges are, where things come and go, are born and die." The terrible child pushed his way into Theo's head. "You will find it instructive, my almost twin, for a little while." Applecore moved in even closer to Theo's neck, although she was on the far side from the boy. "Don't talk to him!" But he could not resist. The Grimm's killing of the dragon had heartened him. "And this is where you're going to bring on this, what is it called, eternal night?" "Old night. Ah, yes, but I will not bring it on, as you say. It already is. I will simply open a door so that it can make its way to the mortal world. Not that your world is a stranger to it, to the old ways and the old nightmares, but there are only a few small points of contact now, like tiny holes in an otherwise watertight ship. They're not enough to change things. But I will open a great gash in the side of reality as they know it on your world, a hole too big for patching or bailing. Once old night starts pouring in, bringing chaos such as even your troubled world has not known in 1,000 years or more, nothing will stop it." He sighed. "It will be lovely, like bathing in a river of discordant music, a blizzard of dark light, screams, useless prayers, the unique sound of the very lattices of reality coming apart. I will drink it all in until I am intoxicated. It is what I have waited my entire life to do." Theo was sickened, but would not show it. "All what, 7 years?" "I have had as many moments of life as you, my half-brother, my blind and deaf twin, but mine have passed in this world. We age more slowly here, breathing the airs of fairy, but you know the date of my birth. That was something else of mine that was given to you." "But you know what I had that you didn't? A real family, a life." Theo wanted to hurt the smiling creature shaped like a child in any way he could, as though it were the worst parts of himself that sat beside him, gloating and mocking. "Love. Love, do you even know what that is?" The terrible child laughed. "Do you?" Hellebore turned in irritation. "Shut your mouth." Something seized control of Theo, and he could no longer speak. The child smiled and looked out the window. The battle coaches drove on, the winding road taking them down into what seemed a kind of wooded valley thick with ground fog. Great corridors of uninterrupted darkness yawned between the trees. Empty buildings still stood on either side of the bumpy road, but they had been dug straight into the ground and seemed almost invisible. Only dusty openings, too regular to be animal dens, or here and there a jut of roof protruding from a pile of dirt or tangle of leaves showed that someone had once lived there. "I don't like this place," Applecore moaned. "It's bad." Theo could not talk and could barely move. He let his head loll back and stared up through the domed top of the coach at the tips of the old tall trees. The tops of the tree line on either side shimmied up and down as they passed, like wave patterns on an oscilloscope. Something was tracking them from high above, a minuscule winged shape barely visible against the darkening sky, and for a heart-freezing moment Theo thought it was another dragon coming down from the heights. But he realized he would never have been able to see anything that far up through the swirling mists. It was a gray bird, passing back and forth only a few dozen yards overhead, as though it were keeping the car in sight. An owl, perhaps, a small hawk. Then the mists thickened and the sky seemed to grow darker. As he lost sight of the bird, he felt a moment of sadness. Maybe the last free creature I'll see, Theo thought. I should have told Applecore to fly away while I could still talk. They say they don't care about her, but once they've done whatever it is to me, they might just kill her for spite. A brief image of her back in the jar, but this time in the long-fingered hands of Anton Hellebore, or worse, the hungry child, pulled up a groan of fear and disgust that died somewhere between his lungs and larynx, unable to overcome Lord Hellebore's order of silence. And it will get better still, the terrible child silently mocked him. Theo whimpered. He could not force the voice, the presence, out of his head. It was like struggling in a nightmare. Pain and terror, such as is visited on the waking world only once in an entire epoch. Just wait, oh my brother, you will see such sublime things. The winding road took them over a rise, and they emerged for a moment from the endless colonnade of phantom trees. A great forested valley stretched before them, a thick carpet of treetop foliage that rose unexpectedly from the lowlands and ended in a ring of huge trees at the valley's center that stood more than twice the height of the others. He could see something gleaming at the center of that ring, a dull shine like old silver. But then the coach crested the rise and started back down. Within moments, they were deep in the blind woods again. The trees around him were taller now, vast cylinders of bark whose lowest branches jutted far above the top of the coach, and it made Theo wonder how big the trees in the ring at the center must be. Giants. The light was dim here, but in some odd way still seemed too bright, like the sideways glare just before sunset. In fact, even through his own fog of weariness and despair, he could not help feeling the strangeness of the place. Not just the light, but the way that loud noises like the engines seemed unduly muffled, yet quiet sounds like the wind through the trees penetrated even the hardened bubble windows. Even the air he breathed was both thinner and headier than it should have been. It all contributed to a growing sense of dislocation like a bad drug trip, as though reality itself were congealing around him, time slowing, everything increasing in density. No, he thought, it's not getting more dense. That's too scientific or something. It's just getting... He had to hunt through his bruised, exhausted mind until he could come up with Applecore's words. Thick. Very gets thicker here. There's just more of everything. The passengers were all silent as the convoy wound through the foggy, light-streaked woodland. Hellebore and his monstrous stepchild, perhaps lost in dreams of what was to come, Tansy distracted, and still apparently in pain. Only Applecore had anything to say. She crept close to his ear and whispered, "Be brave, Theo." But there was nothing he could have said to that, even if he could speak. At last the armored coach slowed and stopped. The world seemed to have dropped away in front of them, and it took Theo a little while to realize that he was not looking at some kind of interdimensional nothingness, but the silvery blankness of a still lake shrouded in fog. "Get out," said Hellebore. Theo was a prisoner in his own clumsy body. All he could do was obey. Outside the protective bubble of the coach, the world felt even stranger. He had often heard or read of silences that were tangible, so thick they could be cut with a knife, but this was the first time he had ever truly experienced such a thing. The quiet was stiflingly heavy, as though the entire world had drawn in its breath and held it. He wasn't the only one to feel overwhelmed. The ogre guards didn't even waste a glance on him as they got out, but like tourists come to the big city, leaned back and stared up at the immense ring of trees surrounding the lake. Theo found himself doing the same. The trees were as huge as they had looked at a distance, big as office towers, the innermost circle stretching so high that Theo guessed that full daylight only touched the water for a few minutes around noon each day. The size of them was arresting enough, but although Theo knew little about trees, it was also hard to ignore the fact that no two of them in the ring were quite the same. The tree beneath which they had parked was a sky-scraping pine, but it stood between a massive oak and an improbably vast birch whose pale trunk loomed like a moon rocket. This made the ring of giant trees around the lake seem artificial. Odd, when in other ways the place seemed so extremely natural, almost throbbing with primordial grandeur and solitude. Also, each tree was rooted in its own grassy mound of earth, each mound as big as a school playing field, so that if it had not been for the brilliance of colors, the hundreds of different shades of greenery, the splendid diversity of gray, white, and brown trunks, and the way their terrifyingly distant tops swayed in a breeze unfelt at ground level, the giants might almost have been titanic statues of trees instead of real living things, a sort of arboreal museum for young gods, with each display set on its own plinth overlooking the lake. As the last members of the convoy climbed out to stand beside the lake, Theo looked out across the expanse of mirror-still water. The fog had grown a little thinner, and he could now see a bump at the center of it all, a low island several hundred yards from the shore, a bizarrely unassuming lump in the midst of so much majesty, its outlines partially hidden by low, drifting mist. The island had no tall trees. It was covered with grass and underbrush, which made it hard to see against the forest on the shore behind it. But even through the mist and in this dim, directionless afternoon light, Theo could see something sparkling at the island's center, like a pile of diamonds. Hellebore walked to the edge of the lake and raised his hand, a gesture so imperially casual that any Caesar would have been envious. At first, Theo thought that he was summoning one of his bodyguards, or his son, but then a long, low boat detached itself from the shadows at the island's waterline and began to move toward them across the lake, a robed and hooded figure sitting in the stern. It all seemed a little too much, even to Theo's exhausted eye. The legendary ferryman out of the old myths coming to take him away. But that had been a river in that story, hadn't it? It was hard to live in the middle of all these old tales, to try to make sense of them. In fact, he felt like he was being eaten by a story with teeth. The boat moved swiftly. Within what seemed to Theo only a minute or two, he had so few minutes left, and even in this place of clotted time, they were racing by so quickly. The silent craft was sliding up to the bank. The boatman was small and slender, with a handsome long-nosed face, ears that would make a bat proud, and a shock of graying hair. He was chained to the bench by a shiny ring around his neck and, if what protruded from beneath his robe was any indication, had woolly legs and goat's feet. "Still here, I see," said Hellebore. "By dint of your chain around my neck, my lord?" said the goat-legged man with a slight bow. His voice was high-pitched and extremely musical. Theo thought that in another story, one that was going to have a happier ending than this one, it would be interesting to hear him sing. "The iron in it burns at night and keeps me from sleeping. I think of you during all the lonely hours. You haven't by any chance come to drown yourself in a fit of remorse, have you?" Hellebore didn't waste energy on either a smile or a frown. "No, we will cross to the island." The handsome little man nodded his head. "Nidris Hellebore, it shall be done." Now that he was closer, Theo could see that the shape of the ferryman's face was much less human than he had initially thought. Lord Hellebore glanced back at the small crowd from the coaches that had gathered on the grassy bank behind him. 8 or 10 constables, half a dozen ogre bodyguards, and Hellebore's son and stepchild and fellow fairy lads, although Tansy, for one, looked as though he would be happy to stay behind, and even Lord Foxglove looked a little nervous, as well as the prisoners, Cumber and Theo. Then he looked at the boat, a small barge made of ancient black wood. "How many trips?" asked Hellebore. The ferryman smiled. "All will cross together, my lord." Hellebore ordered Theo onto the boat. It pitched gently as he stepped from the lakeside, and Applecore held onto his hair tightly. But even in his exhausted and almost helpless state, he found it easy to stay upright. As the constables prodded him toward the stern, the rest of Hellebore's little party followed, leaving only the trio of Dooney drivers in their bug-like riot gear to wait with the battle coaches. Just as the ferryman had said, there was room for all, although to Theo it seemed no more credible now that it had happened than it had been while everyone was still on the bank. In whichever direction he looked, the boat seemed to stretch a little wider than was actually possible. When Cumber and the last of the constables were on board, the craft turned away from the bank, apparently of its own accord, and began a stately progress back toward the island. The ferryman was looking at Theo with interest. His amber eyes slanted upward, glowing like the gaze of a jack-o'-lantern. But the look of intelligence and the deep laughter lines on his brown skin almost made up for it. "You have something of the smell of mortals about you," the ferryman said, "but not quite. What is your name?" To his surprise, Theo found he could talk again. "I'm not sure anymore. Theo Vilmos. Septimus Violet. It doesn't seem like it matters much." He could feel the terrible child on the edge of his thoughts, although he could not see him, and the cold glow of the child's anticipation for what was to come made it hard to concentrate. "Robin is my name." The ferryman looked Theo up and down. "Goodfellow is my other name, if not always my true tale, I must regretfully admit. I see you have an appointment with the Wet Sisterhood." "What?" Theo glanced over at Hellebore, but if the Flower Lord had noticed Theo could speak once more, he didn't seem disturbed by it. "He means the nymphs," Applecore said quietly. Your bracelet?" Theo looked down at the knotted band of grass, then at the still water all around them, the surface barely disturbed by the boat's passage. The lake seemed as silent and ancient as the forest. Theo could imagine almost anything living in its depths. "Ah," he said. "Yes. Well, they'll have to get in line." Robin smiled again, showing surprisingly sharp teeth. "In fact, it is one of the oldest and greatest of the sisterhood who lives here. But never doubt she will take you just as quickly if you fall in as her youngest and hungriest sisters. Perhaps you should not sit so close to the edge." Theo shrugged. If it was hard to concentrate with the rising joy of the terrible child pushing at his mind, it was almost harder to care. I'm not very good at moving right now, unless Lord Hellebore allows me to. Robin nodded and tapped the ring on his neck. Our current master is indeed one for bindings and such like, isn't he? He leaned forward and said in a loud theatrical whisper, We wonder what sort of games his mamma played with him when he was wee, our Nidrus. You are alive because you are a curiosity, Puka. Apparently Hellebore had not been ignoring their conversation entirely. But curiosity is not a very strong emotion, and thus not much of a guarantee of safety. I take your excellent point, Lord Hellebore. Despite the ring on his neck and the heavy links that chained him to the bench, Robin Goodfellow contrived a graceful little bow. And what, he said to Theo, is the purpose of your visit here, if I may ask? Not that I'm complaining. A little company helps the centuries to ease by a bit faster. Theo sighed. I think we're going to destroy the world. Somebody's world, anyway. It used to be my world. Ah, said Robin. Another busy day for the Flower Lords. But he seemed depressed by the news and did not speak again. The ferry passed through a last swirl of mist and grounded against the island. Okay, well, I guess we have time to start another chapter. Chapter 41, The Cathedral. The island itself was not very big, but even so, as Theo acted out Hellebore's command and disembarked under the utterly unnecessary guns of the guards, he found himself having trouble understanding what it looked like. It was not the dying light that made its shape hard to judge, or the shroud of mist that rose from the water's edge, or even the disorienting shimmer at the top of the low hill, although they all added to its confusion. Instead, it was something in the place itself, some intense anomaly that was part of its very nature, as if the primeval silence of the ring of giant trees became something more concentrated and yet paradoxically also more cloudy here, a pulse of irreducible strangeness at the still heart of Fairy that confused Theo's senses just as the magnetism of the North Pole deranged compasses. Soon, the avid voice whispered in his head, but it was talking to itself now, even more than to him, a child's quiet song of impatience and hunger. Soon, soon. This was its hour, and Theo could only wonder what horrors had come before this crowning moment to create something that looked forward so gleefully to madness and destruction being visited on an entire world. What he could make out through the disorienting nature of the place and his own hopeless misery was that the island sloped up from the water's edge to the top, a long, low hillock covered with uneven grass and gnarled shrubbery. In a depression at the top, hidden from the base of the island by the curve of the land, lay whatever was creating that blur of inconstant, refracted light which hung over the hilltop as though something up there was trying, with some difficulty, to birth a rainbow. They trooped up the hill, Lord Hellebore first, his flawless white suit a beacon in the gloom. The little monster with Theo's features followed right behind, hurrying along on his short legs, excited even in his physical movements as though he were a normal child being led through the gates of the zoo. Theo and Cumber followed, prodded along by helmeted constables. Then Tansy, Anton Hellebore, Foxglove, and Thornapple, and the rest of the guards. The ogre bodyguards brought up the rear, walking silently, very attentive to the surroundings despite the minuscule size of the landscape they were surveying. We're in the real middle of it now, Applecore whispered in a choked voice. Never She fell silent for a moment. I've heard. Again she ran out of words. It's here, Theo. What? He whispered back, fighting to stay calm, fighting to concentrate his straggling thoughts. What is this? Somehow the conversation with Robin Goodfellow seemed to have released him from Hellebore's silence. A momentary flicker of hope. Perhaps the ferryman had other powers and could intervene on his behalf, or at least interfere with Hellebore's control over him, died when Theo looked back and saw the black boat slipping out of sight around the edge of the island, gliding into a curtain of mist. Goodfellow again sat hunched in the stern, motionless as a stone garden fawn, looking at nothing except his own cloven hooves. This is where the old mound was? The first mound. Applecore was struggling to keep her voice under control. It was not just caution or confusion making her speak that way. She was struggling against overwhelming panic. This is where the king and queen lived. Here? Theo looked from side to side. Even this small freedom from his lockstep obedience to Hellebore seemed exhilarating, dangerous. On this poky little thing? He must have spoken louder than he intended. Cumber Sedge looked over at them, his face gray, his expression hopeless. Just when he had thought he could not feel worse, Theo had a cold squeeze of guilt. Look what happens to the people who trusted me, who treated me like a friend. There wasn't any water here then? Applecore whispered. No lake, not like this. Just a mound. Deep into the ground it goes, deeper than the elder trees even. The first place of all the people. Theo felt something even chillier grab at his vitals. Was Hellebore planning to lead them down into the earth, into some horrible tomb in the wet ground under the lake? He didn't know why it actually made any difference, but if he had to die, he wanted to do it under an open sky. Here! The child's voice rang in his head, triumphant, mad. Here! The waiting is ended. Theo reached the top of the crest and saw what was making the air shimmer. I think that's where we're going to stop, because we're running out of book, and I want to make sure we have readings left to do. So, since we have about a minute and a half left before the top of the hour, I'm going to sing you some selections from the operas of Giacomo Puccini. No, actually I'm not, because I don't have the voice for it. At least, I don't have the voice to sing it like a human being. I could probably do you some Puccini as sung by hamsters or chipmunks or something. But anyway, so here we are, and we are coming up to the ending things, and I do want to say, what do we got left? We have approximately 16, we got about 50, 60 pages, but that reading went faster than I thought it would, so I'm still trying to gauge it. And then if worse comes to worse, I think we probably could work out both halves next weekend, and if I have to go over a little bit, that's okay. I could run a little bit longer instead of like today, ending early, stalling desperately, trying to pretend like you won't notice that I've done it. Like, hey, don't look here. No, we're not finishing early. Nothing to see. Move along. Anyway, my brain, it's on fire. No, it's just old and tired. An old, tired brain that's done a lot of work. Not just today, but for years and years. On all kinds of things like how to walk, how to eat, how to not put your children out in a cardboard box in the Safeway parking lot and say free babies written on the side. Anyway, so that's it for tonight. Thank you for bearing with me. We're a tiny bit shorter than usual because I also started fairly late, but that's okay. That's okay. We're going full bore here. We're going right up. It's 8 o'clock. Could be worse. Could be worse is what I'm trying to say. Anyway, so at that point, I will tidy up. I will parcel up all of my picnic stuff and put it back in the basket. And I will get ready to mosey on back to Weekday Town, which is just a few miles ahead of me. And I will, as I always do, thank you so very much for coming to join me and hanging out with me. I really like reading aloud to people. It's great fun. Now I'm getting to the point where I have to start thinking about what we're going to read next. So that will be strange and interesting. But until then, please take good care of yourselves. That is the most important thing. First and foremost, take care of yourself, because then if you're well taken care of, then you can take care of other people, your loved ones, your friends, your neighbors, the others who need it. So with that, I exhort you to do all those things. I repeat my earlier thanks, and I urge you to come back and join me. Next reading will be next Sunday, 2 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, and we will be getting close to finishing up The War of the Flowers, so that will be fun. And for those of you who haven't read the books, there's still a few interesting little tweaks and twists to come, so stay tuned. Come join me, please. And with that, I say once more, good night. Great to have you. See you soon. Peace.